So let's see as others join us. Fantastic. Serbia, hello. It is, as I said, Georgia, this is like literally a slice of the world. It's so fun to do this. All right. I'm going to give one more minute for people to join us, and then we're going to go ahead and kick it off because we have a schedule. India has joined. Hello. All right. Saudi. Cornelia? Cornelia, you're from Canada and not Saudi. But hello. All right, Seoul. Wonderful. Well, as we're still getting some people joining us, I'm going to begin our webinar today just with a couple comments before we get going, and then I'm going to introduce Georgia East, who's joining us. You can see her picture there. But first of all, you're going to notice that I am not in a chef jacket today. And normally I live in Chicago, and normally I'm joining you with a cup of coffee in the morning. We have lots of discussions about coffee, and then we sort of make fun with the people from Australia who are having their glass of wine. But today I'm on vacation and I am in France, and so yes, we are having wine already today. So it's a beautiful thing. It's the middle of the afternoon versus early in the morning. Also, we are, see who else has joined us. Bulgaria, yes, fantastic. So let's go ahead and get started here because 30 minutes always flies by so very quickly. Now, last time we were together, it's been a couple months. We took a little month off, but last time we were together, we had a wonderful speaker from the University of Barcelona who talked to us about the Mediterranean cuisine. And the reason we were doing Mediterranean cuisine is because that's what you asked for when we said, what are the things that you really want to learn more about? You're like, Mediterranean cuisine. And so we had this great presentation about the health, the nutrition, and the sustainability of the Mediterranean diet, and very much of an educational format, PowerPoint, the whole thing. But as we like to do, everything that we do at Feed the Planet is about education, inspiration, and that moves us all to action. And so today we're talking a little more about the how of the Mediterranean diet. One of the things we talked about was, it's great if you're in the Mediterranean, it's easy to do the Mediterranean diet, but what about if you're in other parts of the world, and how does that work, and what are some ideas there? So with that, and for that, we reached out. We were thinking, like, how far could we get away from the Mediterranean? We were like, hey, how about South Africa? And that's where Georgia East is joining us from today. So really quickly, Georgia East, fast introduction. She is a cook, writer, photographer. She graduated from, and I know she doesn't want to talk about this, but it's in your bio, so too bad, from the University of Cape Town with a degree in English literature and journalism. And she writes extensively on food, travel, lifestyle for various publications, both locally and internationally. She is a self-taught photographer and food stylist, and Georgia has shot numerous campaigns, menu imagery, social media content for brands, various projects, etc., including her first ever cookbook, West Coast Wander. I got to find out how to get one of these, by the way, just disease. Published in 2019 by Penguin Random House. So she is heavily inspired by Mediterranean cuisine. This is how this all fits together. And Georgia spends her time between Cape Town and the small fishing town of Veldrift, I hope I said that right, on South Africa's west coast, where she combines local seafood and indigenous ingredients with recipes and flavors from countries in the Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, etc., Morocco, etc., France. So with that, Georgia, a huge welcome to World Chefs to Feed the Planet, and I'm so glad you were able to take the time today.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's fantastic to be here.
Now, to kick things off, we were talking a little bit before we sort of started this webcast today. And I'd like you to tell this little story because I think it really brings together what we're trying to do in a very sort of visceral, visual way. And it's that story of driving on the west coast of South Africa and looking out at the ocean. And I'm going to let you tell the rest of the story because I think it gets us into today.
Yes, well, it's pretty much the story of how I always joke, linking the Atlantic with the Aegean. And it was a couple of years ago, and I was on a family holiday up the West Coast where I now live. And we were driving along from one town that's now my hometown to another, and I sort of looked out across the bay, St. Helena Bay, and just it was this blue ocean and low brown tawny colored hills and this blue sky. And I thought, well, I've never been to Greece, but this looks identical to the pictures I've seen of Greece. And I kind of took it a bit further. I thought, well, the cuisine I've always enjoyed eating is very much Mediterranean, with a specific emphasis on Greek food. So like your tara masalata, your tzatziki, your lamb, food like that, definitely seafood. And I thought, well, this is the food I like to eat and the food I like to cook. And here I am on the West Coast where it's the same climate. It's a very much a Mediterranean climate. We cultivate similar produce, citrus, olives, wheat, lamb, potatoes. Maybe I can link the two. And what happened was I was actually writing for a magazine at the time, and I put together a series of 4 recipes and 4 stories about 4 West Coast towns. And the series itself was such a hit that I thought, well, let me put this into a pitch and send it to a couple of publishers. And I was very, very lucky, insanely lucky, that the first publisher I sent it to, Penguin Random House, picked it up as a concept for a book. And I was able to publish my very first cookbook at the very tender age of 27 years old. So, and through that, it's just been an absolute celebration and an exploration for me as a cook to really just link the 2 areas and the 2 cuisines, working with the concept of the Mediterranean diet and those kind of recipes, but using indigenous ingredients and foods from here in South Africa.
I love that. And I just love that sort of like, wow, it looks like the Aegean. And also, I think just as a wonderful parenthesis, especially for some of the younger people, younger in our profession, people who are joining us, I think your message, Georgia, is dreams do come true.
Absolutely.
When
Absolutely.
you got that book. So let's kind of jump into this, and maybe sort of in a general way. If you could just maybe discuss a little bit this concept of incorporating Mediterranean influences into diverse culinary traditions around the world, and then maybe we can sort of dive more into some of the specifics in a little bit. But just as a general concept, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do feel that, especially in a country such as South Africa, that we have so many different nationalities, so many different backgrounds, so many different food cultures. The one thing I wanted to bring forth was to not erase South African cuisine, so to speak, but to sort of highlight the more overlooked ingredients that we get in this country. And I feel that the best way to do that was to apply Mediterranean diet or Mediterranean principles to cooking them, because it's very... the thing that draws me to Mediterranean cuisine is nothing's overdone. Every single aspect of any dish you have, each ingredient can shine for itself. And so I wanted to move away from sort of the heavy sauces and the deep frying and the sugars and the flavors and stuff of perhaps more traditional South African cooking, and embrace a lighter, more vibrant, healthier approach. So in doing that, using ingredients like olive oil, using ingredients like herbs, lemon to flavor the food instead of the heavy ingredients that most South African palates are used to.
Really interesting. And maybe my next question is a little bit of a follow-up on that, which is, and it's so I have on my screen over here, my chat is still open. And so I'm seeing people coming as, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Iran. What are the benefits to them, to their cuisines, if they sort of embrace some of the maybe ingredients, but also just sort of some of the concepts around Mediterranean cuisine? How could that be beneficial to them?
I would say that it would be beneficial for them in allowing them to sort of rediscover ingredients that they may have previously taken for granted. Well, I'm not too clued up on cuisines in different countries, like the ones you've just listed, although I want to be soon. I know here in South Africa, we have a number of ingredients that have often been overlooked because they may be not so fashionable or not so interesting or not so attractive to look at. And for example, the example we were using earlier is our local fish here called a snook, which is like a barracuda. And that's always kind of been pushed to the side as sort of more low-income food, and it's not particularly attractive to eat. It's got these very long bones, but done in the right way, specifically using Mediterranean flavors and an approach. So light drizzle of olive oil, a bit of a squeeze of lemon, maybe some fresh rosemary, just cooked over, we call it here a braai, but cooked over the coals, and you have something so special. So I do feel in kind of rediscovering ingredients that you've previously taken for granted, by using Mediterranean flavors, keeping it light, keeping it fresh, keeping it simple.
I like that word simple and fresh, because, that is, if we look sort of today at what the trends are around food, that whole concept of fresh and simple has really bubbled up. And you're right, it's very much Mediterranean. Now, we were talking, I was talking for a second about the fish thing, right? Because we were talking and used a wonderful term. In the US, we've talked about the concept of trash fish, using fish that would be otherwise thrown away, or certainly not valued. And yours was unfashionable fish. Is that what it was?
Unfashionable fish, yes.
Tell me just a little bit more about that movement and what you're doing with that specifically.
So unfashionable fish is a concept I actually came up with on the spot a couple of months ago in a radio interview. And actually after that gave it some thought. South Africa in itself is not really a big seafood eating nation. We love things like we love prawns, and we've got our local rock lobster, which is delicious, albeit very endangered. But otherwise, we are looking a lot to other countries for seafood inspiration. So sushi is incredibly popular. And with that, we have, imported Norwegian salmon, yellowfin tuna, and other exotic fish. Whereas we ignore this wealth of fish that we have off our own coastline, because first and foremost, South Africa is a coastal nation. And the sort of fish we have here rivals some of the most sought after fish in the rest of the world. For example, we have the snook I was telling you about, which has always been off-putting to more Western palates because it's got these crazy long bones. Then we've got our own, massive shoals of sardine, of anchovies, of pilchard, beautiful oily fish. We've got a great fish, which is called in the vernacular a maasbanker, which is a horse mackerel. And it's an incredibly oily fish, very, very strong flavor. And it's crazy that in the Mediterranean, these sort of fish are prized. And in South Africa, they get turned into fish meal, they get canned, they often just get used as bait. So I'm kind of wanting, through this concept that I have of unfashionable fish, to take these fish that usually people don't even know exist, let alone eat, and actually bring them to the forefront with using very easy, inspiring, and simple recipes for people to follow along, to get them, to encourage them to eat them out and cook them at home.
That's great. That's so interesting, because part of that Mediterranean diet is about diversity. It's about eating a diverse set of foods. And when we look at things like the ocean, it's really to sort of say, what is that enormous diversity of sea life that is out there, and plant life. We've talked about seaweed a lot before too, that are edible and delicious and maybe overlooked. So I think chefs, this is something to think about, right? So could you put on your menus that we are now featuring unfashionable fish, right? Because there's especially the younger audiences, the Gen Zs of the world, they want to be part of the unfashionable movement because, counterculture and everything. Anyways, that's really, really interesting. So can you talk a little bit about, some examples, specific examples of dishes, ingredients, etc., from sort of international cuisines, or maybe from what you're doing there, that can easily be aligned with that Mediterranean diet? The things we learned about, the good fats, the focus, as we were just talking about fish, on fish, on things like fiber and fresh and vegetables and et cetera. Examples, some ideas maybe that we could, be inspired by.
Well, one of the things that I discovered when I was working on my cookbook is how you can take, I would say, just ordinary pantry ingredients and utilize them in a way that all of a sudden feels like you are on a Mediterranean holiday. And so things like here on the West Coast, we've got an heirloom bean called a heerboentjie, which translates into the Lord's bean. And the closest thing I can compare it to is a butter bean. So those very boring little beans that you either get dried or tinned in brine. And I actually used those in a recipe for my cookbook, which is based on a Greek recipe that combines tomato and oregano and garlic, and it's baked in a clay dish in the oven. It's the most comforting, most robust for someone like a meat eater such as myself. It's one of those dishes, vegetarian dishes that you don't actually, vegan dishes that you don't actually miss the meat. And so I liked taking the concept of something that is found locally, something that is, again, overlooked, a pantry ingredient, and something that is plant-based. Even though I don't myself follow an entirely plant-based diet, I am trying to incorporate more plant-based eating, and taking that and making something that is so comforting, so rib-sticking, that even meat-mad South Africa would enjoy eating it as a main or even as a side.
So a little follow-up to that one. So you published this book, and it's focused on Mediterranean flavors, but Mediterranean flavors from your part of the world, and
yes,
those two sort of fit together. What's the response been? Because you said, like, the meat eating South African, people, and then you have these beautiful beans cooked in a clay pot. What has been the response? Because a lot of times what we'll hear from different chefs around the world, especially when we talk about things like plant-based or vegetarian or vegan food, is nobody wants that. But tell me, what's been the response?
I would say that when it comes to plant-based, South Africa's definitely still got a way to go, although there is a very large movement and it's a very inspiring movement. But I would say the response has been a very, very, very positive one. Mainly when it comes to fish and seafood, just to digress back to that for a second, a lot of South Africans are incredibly intimidated with cooking it, with eating it. So fish and seafood has always been this thing that we order in restaurants, or we go out to eat it. We don't cook it at home. And I'd say through the book, the biggest positive response I got was for making fish and seafood accessible and for making it not so frightening. And then for taking, again, simpler, boring ingredients, so to speak, and showing people you can cook them in a way that makes it exciting and makes it appealing. Yeah, just on that.
That sounds amazing. And when it comes to simplicity, let's just go back to that for a second, because did you do other recipes in your book and in your research? Again, it's all about this concept of local. So what's around me? And anybody in the world can ask that question. Whatever country you're in, whatever city you're in, part of what we always talk about is what are the local things around you that you can celebrate that maybe aren't being cooked? And then how can you maybe pair them with some of the principles of the Mediterranean diet? We've talked a lot about simplicity. Do you have some examples of just, things that you've done that are just so simple, and because of that, it's so delicious, but still combining local and Mediterranean concepts?
Yes, absolutely. So I was very inspired by our local flora in the area, specifically on the West Coast. And one of the main ingredients we get, especially now in the wintertime in our hemisphere, is something called a veldkool, which is a wild asparagus. And one of the favorite recipes I have in my book is I saute wild asparagus in butter flavored with bokum. And bokum is our own West Coast anchovy. It's a desiccated salt-dried fish that, when sliced thinly and marinated in olive oil, it tastes very similar to an anchovy. And it was just pretty much 3 ingredients. So you could use asparagus, butter or olive oil, and 1 or 2 brown anchovy fillets. And there you have the most exquisite side with chicken, with steak, with a nice piece of fish, or even on its own. And I think through learning more about Mediterranean diet principles and the sort of the core ingredients, the main ingredients, your base ingredients for Mediterranean flavor, I discovered how easy it is to make things taste amazing. You aren't needing 10 to 15 ingredients for a recipe. Sometimes you just need 2 or 3 and you can create magic. So I would say that was a very inspiring thing for me to unpick and understand.
That actually is making me really hungry. But anyways, side note. So for everybody who's joining us, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. But another thing, if you're doing something in your country, I'm just curious, we've never done this before, put in the Q&A little button down there, what you're doing in your part of the world that is combining that concept of local and that concept of, the tenets of the Mediterranean cuisine. Just love to hear some things. But before, Georgia, we were talking a little bit about this indigenous idea, because I think that, you very properly said, local is looking at local ingredients, but local is also this concept of indigenous. And you had mentioned specifically about one of the products that you're making. And so I'm just let's set it up to you that way, but talk a little bit about the indigenous piece when it comes to, again, combining what you're doing in South Africa with Mediterranean cuisine.
So, Chris, I would say one of the obstacles I faced when doing this book is because of where we are geographically situated in the world. It's difficult to get your hands on certain ingredients, sometimes impossible. So I wanted to take things that were locally available and affordable and relatable for South Africans and show how I can change this local ingredient, into something that is more recognizable. So again, I said earlier that I've always been a fan of Greek cuisine, specifically like your meze, so like tara masalata. And one of these sort of byproducts that we get here on the West Coast from the aforementioned fish, the snook, is their roe. Now, tara masalata is traditionally made with cod roe, preferably undyed or dyed. We can get dyed cod roe in this country, but you kind of want to use something local. So I've been playing around with a tara masalata recipe using the roe of the snook, which does give it a fishier flavor. But of course, for someone like me, I enjoy that. But just taking something that, firstly, it's dirt cheap. Snook roe is, so locally it's served here, it is deep fried and served with lemon, which is delicious on its own. But I wanted to turn it into something that was representative of the Mediterranean culture and cuisine. And so I enjoy the fact that I can take a local, again, unfashionable ingredient and turn it into something that could be served on any table in the world as tara masalata.
And how are people, do people enjoy it? What's the feedback been?
Absolutely. You're always going to get people who are deeply rooted in tradition and who are like, no, this is the way my grandma's grandma did this. We can only do it this way. And then you get other people who say, hey, the last time I tasted tarma like this was on my trip to Greece like 10 years ago, which of course I just get bowled over because I'm so flattered by such a compliment. And it comes down to anything, any kind of, I mean, you were saying, Chris, earlier about how each area in the Mediterranean, or indeed sometimes the world, has their sort of version of a fish soup. And here in South Africa, we've got a potjie, which can be meat or fish, or we've got a very well-known West Coast recipe called snook head soup. So it's fish head soup. Again, like traditionally eaten by the poorer members of the community. And only now we're seeing it in restaurants. We're seeing it start to pick up. It's actually such a delicacy and uses things like fish cheeks and all the flavor from the head that most westernized eaters would previously have turned away. Oh no, that's especially not in South Africa. It's fine to have in the south of France, but not in South Africa. So at least through that, we are now seeing more of an acceptance to traditional recipes that have a Mediterranean twist already, which is very refreshing.
That's wonderful. And again, think about, from our perspective as chefs, we're always thinking about profit, right? So, the ability to use the entire fish, the ability to use parts of the fish, that is, as you said, dirt cheap. How fun that is for us. Anyways, last sort of question for you. And this has probably nothing to do with what you're doing, but I'm going to ask it anyways. One of the interesting things that was brought up on our discussion with the University of Barcelona was that part of what is the concept of the Mediterranean cuisine also revolves around this concept of using food to, and I should say dining and eating together as a time of connection, of unhurried connection with humans that is then stress reducing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in one respect, yes, it's about the food, but in the other respect, it's about how we do the food or how we serve or enjoy the food. Is that something you've thought about in South Africa, or is that something you're already doing and doesn't really make an impact? Just curious.
I absolutely love that question. This is one thing that actually I didn't really need to put any input on, because already South Africans as a whole, we are very convivial people. We're very happy people. We love, setting a table and getting outside and pouring some excellent South African wine and just enjoying each other's company. We, on a weekly basis, will light a fire, even not to cook anything on it, but just to have it for ambiance and for joy. I think it's kind of built into South Africans' DNA, whether you are Xhosa, whether you're English, whether you're Afrikaans, whether you Cape Malay, it's just built into our DNA to share food with friends and family. And so that was thankfully an amazing aspect of merging South African cuisine with the Mediterranean concept that I didn't really have to work on. We already have it.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great response. And that just makes me want to come to South Africa even more. So there are some wonderful comments, by the way, in the chat if you're watching, but I'm going to wrap this up because this has just been really, really inspiring. And I know that for many of you around the world, one of the things we talked about on the last webcast that we did with the person who joined us from the University of Barcelona was this whole concept of, how do you take this and move it around the world? And, Georgia is not an expert in the cuisine of Finland and China, and, but she's an expert in her cuisine, just like so many of you who are joining us today are experts in the cuisine of your part of the world. And so I think the assignment for all of us then is to just kind of go back to where we are, where we live, and look at what is there, local, sustainable, indigenous, maybe disregarded, undervalued, and cook it in ways that are delicious, sustainable, nutritious, and so much that, again, aligning with the concepts, the principles of the Mediterranean diet. Georgia, this has been fantastic. You've inspired me. I'm actually going to look up what a snook looks like. So I'm going to Google it in just a second, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been amazing. And a thank you to everybody who has joined us, taken time out of your day. Time is a precious gift, and we appreciate you being here. And of course, to the folks in Paris, Ayla, to Lynn, the whole group over there who make all this possible. Without them, none of this would happen. So a huge shout out to them. Thank you. And again, Georgia, once again, thank you. It's been great.
Thank you for having me. It's been really wonderful.
And to the rest of you all, have a great rest of your day, evening, morning.